This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for under-resourced women entrepreneurs. And I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. Join me as I talk to women entrepreneurs about the nuts and bolts of their journeys and to experts who will give you insights that are hard to find anywhere else. Let's jump in. What's even more important than an MBA when you're a founder on the lookout for funding? What's one obvious mistake many founders don't even realize they're making when fundraising? What simple exercise will help you find the best sources of capital for where your startup is right now? In this episode, Marie Meslin, former president and executive director of the Capital Network, talks about the one critical factor founders must focus on, easy to avoid mistakes founders make, tips to sharpen your fundraising strategy, and much more. Now, here's Marie. Good afternoon, Marie. We're so excited to have you here today on Invisible Inc. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
You have a pretty fascinating background. I've talked before, and I was looking through your LinkedIn profile. You've done a bunch of stuff in the startup world. So can you just talk us through your journey and how you got to the Capital Network?
Quite frankly, accident. It was accidental that I ended up in this field. And I'm sure for a lot of people, that's how they discover entrepreneurship, right? A little bit accidentally. My background was actually in nonprofits and women's rights, international human rights. And then I also worked for an innovation consultancy in New York and in London. So my background was about how can we have creative new ideas and help change the way people think, but also how do we make things better for people who have been underserved? And I ended up moving to the US. And when I moved here, I just met somebody who said, oh, you know what? I have this job with the Capital Network, but I'm leaving. I think you'd be perfect for it. And they described the organization. I was like, investors, financials, fundraising? No, thanks. That was not what I thought I would be doing. But when I kind of started looking into it and thinking about it, I was like, oh, it's really just about supporting people who have these great innovative ideas and want to make a difference in the world. And you need money for that. And how do you help people succeed in this very difficult field? And so when I started, it was mostly about fundraising education. But because of my background and my interest, I moved the organization towards more of a slant on the new majority and on helping women fundraise, because that's one of the biggest issues in this sector is women are not raising in the same way that men are. In fact, this is a stat that's been thrown around quite a lot, but only less than 3% of VC funding goes to women. And this has gone down in the last few years. So this is really a topical subject and it's not getting better.
Yeah, and spot on. So we're going to dive into all kinds of nuances on that. Before we do that, can you just give us an overview of what the Capital Network is and what the organization does?
So we are a nonprofit. We're actually based out in Massachusetts. And what we do is we provide entrepreneurs fundraising education. So we run 3 programs. And it's an organization that's been around. It was actually started in the 80s by a professor who actually coined the term angel investor. And the idea was really to help entrepreneurs find investors. But since the mid-2000s, it's been a nonprofit with a mission to educate entrepreneurs about fundraising. And the idea really was investors were speaking to early stage entrepreneurs, and they very quickly realized the entrepreneurs just didn't really understand what it meant to receive outside capital, not just for the immediate term, but for the long term of their business. And they really wanted entrepreneurs to be as best equipped as they possibly can so that the investors can make investments in startups that were led by people who really understood what that meant to have that investor-entrepreneur relationship. So we run 3 programs. We have one, which is fundraising education. So any kind of topic that has to do with raising funds outside capital for your company. Obviously, we talk about angel and VC investment. We also teach people about SBIR grants, about equity crowdfunding, about revenue-based financing, like all of the different ways that you can get your first round of capital for your startup. And that is open to anyone, and anyone can come to any of those programs. We also teach entrepreneurs about pitching. We teach them about cap tables. We teach them about 4NA valuations, kind of technical aspects of raising that really nobody teaches you. But our flagship program is actually a 6-month program called the Fellowship for Female Founders. We call it Own Your Raise. And that is a structured program, 6 months long, where we take between 10 and 15 women, first-time founders, raising for the first time, and we help them get everything they need to be ready to fundraise, or at least get everything ready to make that decision as to whether or not they want to. We never say, this is the right path for you. What we want is we want these women to have the right access to education, access to network, access to all of the things that tools and support and mentorship, all of the things that they need so they can make the right decisions for their business. And so that program, we've been doing it since 2016. We've had 90 plus women take part in the program in total. 50% of those have always been women of color. And at this point, they've raised about $65 million collectively. And even just last year's cohort created over 100 jobs. And these are all women based out in New England. So right now the program is a New England based program. And then the final programs that we run is the Investment and Inclusion Series. That is our partnership with Brown University has a group called the VC Inclusion Lab, and they do research on investment and kind of equity and DEI. And they do a lot of data, a lot of research around that. And so we partnered with them to create a series of conversations around how to create a more equitable capital ecosystem. And that goes anything from sourcing to who makes the deals, to how do you structure pitching, how do you collect data, how do you structure an investment firm in a different way so you allow more equity and for the whole kind of capital stack to be more equitable. And that is open to anyone and really addressed to both investors and entrepreneurs. We basically took a series of conversations we had in the summer of 2020 with investors, and we realized that a lot of those topics just kept feeling like they were the same and were being told in the same way. And we really wanted to open those, as imperfect as it is, we wanted to open those to the public so that we could really try and find solutions together rather than pretend we have the solutions. So that's the last program that we run at the Capital Network.
That's a really amazing overview. So what I would love to talk about first is this whole fundraising education, the first set of offerings that you talked about. What have been your observations in terms of the biggest areas of need, especially as they apply to women and diverse women entrepreneurs? And what do you think is causing, if there's any gap, what do you think is causing that gap in education, let's say between women and women of color and comparable male entrepreneurs who might be in the same stage of their startup journey?
There's all sorts of different issues and reasons. I think one of the things, regardless whether it's women or others actually, but when it comes to the technical education, there just isn't a lot of in-depth content out there. There's a lot of things around pitching. There's some programs around financials, but you actually don't find as many really explaining and going deep into what is a cap table, how does it work, how do you think about it, what are your options. There's all of this technical assistance that feels really that it comes out from a black box, and it does, right? These are not conversations, you don't get taught this at your MBA if you are lucky enough to have done one. I don't come from that background. I don't have a financial background. I don't have an MBA. And so for me, even as I was starting to learn about all these things, it just felt really confusing and out of reach. And the language that is used is also very technical. And so it takes a while to really understand what people mean when they say certain terms and what their assumptions are and what they expect. So I think for everyone, it's confusing. So let's just start there, especially if you don't have financial backgrounds. But I think for what we found and the way that we've structured our program moving forward is for women, there's a portion where community is really important and the way that you have to present yourself in every room. So one of the issues that we've seen is you can have access to the best education, you can have the best network of anyone, you can really have access to fantastic mentorship and people who support you and all of that stuff. But if you don't see yourself as a leader, if you don't see yourself as the person who's going to be driving this forward, when most of the time you are likely to be the only woman in the room or the only person of color in the room, then none of it matters. If you can't really present yourself and really own that portion of raising money, leading an organization, having difficult conversations, then having all of the education and all of the support doesn't really matter. So that's a really strong piece that we added in our program, where we already had the education, we already had the mentorship, we already had the network of investors, but what we were missing is that extra component so that women could really understand what kinds of conversations they needed to be ready for. And that's anything from bias and being in the room where uncomfortable conversations are happening, to really representing a whole organization and talking about money, which for some of us is a difficult subject.
That's really insightful and it hits home pretty hard. What have you found to be, let's say, the top 3 switches, either in terms of your belief set, in terms of your actions, in terms of your approach, if you had to list like a top 3, top 5 list of things that flip the switch for women, what have you noticed those to be?
So it's funny. So all of this is going to be based out of what the women have told us. And one of the conversations I recently had is from this past fellow from last year who raised a lot of money. And she started to raise when she was in our program. And it's so simple. Sure, I can't tell you how simple this is, but it is that she realized, and this is when we were really digging deep into this, into the coaching portion, where she realized she wasn't asking for money. She was fundraising, but she wasn't asking for money. So she would go and pitch and talk about her company and talk about the idea and talk about the business and talk about all these things. And then she realized she wasn't clear about what she was asking and what it was for and why, which is so simple. But when all of the focus in the startup world is a lot of the times it's focused on the pitch, it's not focused on the business and how you make money, and making sure that the way you pitch and the way you talk about your company, it's taking that step back from being excited about like your product or your project or your idea or all of that stuff, and being as excited and as communicative and as explicit about how you make money. Because that's actually something that we have to talk to our entrepreneurs about all the time. They're so excited about the technology they built, but they can't tell you how they're actually going to get the funds or how they're going to get their customers to pay for their product, which, in turn is what investors need to understand and they need to know. And if you can't articulate how you're actually making the money and growing the business, then you don't really have a business. You have an idea, and that's great, but that's not what businesses are built on, and that's not how you get outside capital. So that flip around, like, you're not pitching your idea, you're really pitching a business and being clear about what that means.
That resonates a lot. So what do you think is causing that one miss? Is it a blind spot? Is it that they don't think about it like a business?
I don't know if it's that they don't think about it as a business. I think it's just that when you are solving a pain point, you are so excited about your solution. You're so excited about you've built. And as you should be, it's great, right? Especially if you're solving something that's really an issue. I'm not taking any away from that. I think that's really important as well. But I think if you are talking about your business to an investor, you just have to remember who you're talking to and why. As great as your solution might be, like, if you can't make money, then you can't solve that problem for anyone. It's really that simple. So it's great to be excited about what you're solving, but if at the end of the day your company is not making money, then you can't do the thing you want to do. And so being clear about what that gets you and how to talk to people about it is just so important. So part of it is maybe a little bit of that. And quite frankly, talking about money is uncomfortable for a lot of us, right? We haven't been taught to talk about money. It feels weird. Like, I run a nonprofit for a living. Fundraising is really hard for me. I have to ask people for money all the time. And it's still really hard because we've never been told to have those financial conversations. So part of that is can be a little bit ingrained in some of us around it's impolite to talk about money. It's something you do behind closed doors. You have to be able to ask for what you need, but a lot of times we're trained to just ask for just what we think can like be okay for the other person. I do this all the time where I'm like looking for corporate sponsors. I'm like, oh, okay, well, maybe we'll just ask this because I think they can probably do this, instead of me saying, well, actually, what I need is this. And so I just need to go out and ask for it. Because if I don't ask for it, people can't give it to me. It's, it sounds so simple, but we're so ingrained to just holding back a little bit because it's uncomfortable. And we really have to break through some of that.
Fantastic. So in the training and in the transformations that you've seen with entrepreneurs and women in the TCN programs or through your education, what have been some things that help them become comfortable with this question of talking about money, with presenting themselves comfortably as saying, I need this money and I'm not apologetic about it, and also not under asking and therefore shooting themselves and their businesses in the foot before they even get started? What has worked?
So there's a couple of things. Honestly, one of it is this component of leadership coaching I was mentioning, because again, it's about seeing yourself in that different light as a leader versus as someone who's running a business. If you are able to kind of really look at your role, and if you're really able to take some of that kind of like mysticism out of the whole process, because we know that asking for money and fundraising is a bit of a black box, right? You have conversations to the side, and it's not really open, and, you're negotiating things. So things are very secretive and all of that. So being able to practice those conversations is really helpful. And just, this is something that we talk a lot to our entrepreneurs about. One of them is replacing yourself in the narrative, right? So there's a power imbalance, or at least a perceived power imbalance between entrepreneurs and investors. I need money, you have the power, I'm asking for you to give me something, which feels very uncomfortable. But actually, if you start thinking about what you're doing and reframing how you talk about it, the investors can't do their job without you. It's really that simple. They can't invest if you don't create great businesses to invest in. That's one reframing. Another reframing is around what you're doing has value and worth. You are really helping make a difference. And people want in on that. Like, they're excited about that. Like, instead of being apologetic about like what you need or how much you want to ask for and all of that, it's remembering that you're creating something that has value, and people should be so lucky as to be able to participate in that. So sometimes it's little words. Instead of in your pitch saying the ask, say the opportunity. Sometimes it's little things like that that reframe the way you think about something. Because although, yes, you are asking for money, why are you asking for money? Because this is a great opportunity for people to be excited and involved and give you money and like be part of this journey that you're creating, this momentum, right? Versus like asking, could you please maybe consider possibly giving me something? You know what I mean? And that puts you in a different kind of mental state. And a lot of this is about reframing and reshaping the way we mentally prepare ourselves for these conversations. And the other portion is, if you're really sure about what you're building and what you're doing, and if you have a great understanding of the kinds of people you want to work with, it's okay to say no. Because I think a lot of times, again, when you're fundraising, you think, I need this money. If I don't get this money, things are going to go down, which is why, you shouldn't raise if you are desperate. But a lot of times at some point that happens to all of us. But I think part of it is also being able to say, yeah, this is a good opportunity. And
the fit with the investor.
Thank you. The fit with the investor. So it's okay to say no if you don't feel like that fit is going to be the right one. This is a long-term partnership that you're creating. And so feeling good about saying no, as scary as it is, can really be a great tool in building that confidence around what you need. And part of that is getting that clarity. Well, what is the vision you have for your business? Like, where do you want this to go? What kind of people do you want to surround yourself with? How much money do you actually need? And where do you think you should be getting it from? And all of those things come from really understanding your business well. So it's about really getting the women to see their business from a little bit of an overview, versus when you're so in it and you're just trying to get to the next thing. It's really hard to take that time to see the overview and really plan for what it is that you want. And that's a really big tool.
Given that not everyone can have the access, for example, to TCN's programs, let's say I'm living in Chicago, so I can't attend. Are there other trips or proxies that we can use in the absence of a support network like this to make that switch?
There's some recorded workshops that are open to everyone, and actually you can just check our YouTube page for some of those. And then there's others that will, in 2023, will become available. So recorded materials that people can have access to. So we're working on that because we know there's definitely a need for that kind of thing out there. And then the other thing is, obviously, we live in New England where there's a lot of investors, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of community organizations, and that's great. But there's two things. It's like, let me speak to maybe areas where there's not as many, and then areas like ours where there's arguably too much. Because one of the things we talk about with our entrepreneurs, just in general, wherever you are, like, be selective about where you go and what you do. One of the most precious things you have is time. And in an area like New England or New York or any of the big cities, you could go to a different event, pitch night, investor, whatever, like every single night. Is that really what you need? No, be really focused about what kind of people you want to meet and why, and what you want to get out of those conversations so that you don't lose track. It's great when serendipity takes over and you go to an event, you meet someone, that's fantastic. You are running also a business, and like creating the right balance between what are the right events to be involved in. We had a founder who was great about that. She would always, any event that she was asked to be on or attend in, she was like, she got very clear about who would be at the event so she could really make that decision whether or not this was the right thing. And she would always ask the organizers, like, what is it that you want entrepreneurs to get out of this event? What is it you're trying to create here? So she could get a sense if their kind of mission was aligned with hers. For areas where there's not as much, so much has moved online. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but there are now communities of entrepreneurs where you can meet up every week or so. And I think more than anything, what we found really helps support those women and gaining that confidence is being able to find a small group of entrepreneurs in the same boat as them and being able to share the wins and share the frustrations and brainstorm around like solutions. Because one of the things you don't do when you're an entrepreneur and you're go, go, go all the time, you're so focused on the problems, you don't have time to really celebrate the wins. And creating your own community where you have people you can celebrate that win is so, so important. And wherever you are, there are entrepreneurs around you. Small groups of people you can meet with once a month, even if that's all you can do, but really structure your conversations around, okay, let's go around the table and all celebrate what's the best thing you've achieved in the last week? What's something that you're having an issue with that we can help you figure out? What are some of the things that are going on in terms of not just your business, but like your family life, your home life? For women especially, it's these are not separate things. There's not work over here, home over here. Like it's all connected. And I think that's where a lot of coaching comes into play is like being able to look at all those different aspects and understand that it's not like you're going to go through a hurdle or through a difficult time and then you'll be over it and then everything will be great. It's the hurdle after a hurdle after a hurdle. And you have to be okay with that, knowing that things are going to continue being uncertain for a while. And there may not be no destination, but it's how you put those things into perspective. And having a group of entrepreneurs that can share that burden is really key.
Which I completely agree with. So let's say you don't have access to that, right? Let's say who's not currently affiliated with a university or other natural aggregation of entrepreneurs. Do you have things that you've seen work to actually find and attract these other kinds of similar entrepreneurs? And we say same boat. Can you talk about what some of those attributes might be that would give you that shared experience?
So, in terms of finding entrepreneurs, there's just so many communities online that you can look at and join. I've seen people find other entrepreneurs by creating their own opportunities, right? You never know what's going to happen if you say, talk to your chamber of commerce and just ask them, like, what are the other businesses that are registered with you? And can we do a networking event where, like, we can meet each other? Universities sometimes can be a really great attribute to find, usually younger entrepreneurs, but starting somewhere could be really helpful. Similarly, I've also seen people start various groups where they're like, I want a group because I'm a mother and also an entrepreneur, and I want people who are experiencing the same things as I am, and like the frustration of being a parent and an entrepreneur at the same time. There's a great organization called Parentpreneur that has created this whole platform around Black parents who are also entrepreneurs, and that particular kind of diagram and creating a community around that. So you can build your own community for anything. And if you're shy and if you're not sure, best is to maybe look around at LinkedIn and see what other people are doing. What events are people going to? And then just trying to see if that's something either you would want to create yourself or you want to go to, or there's a way to access remotely. Sometimes that can be helpful too. There's a lot of pitch events that are open to anyone too. So there's a lot of like Founders Live is one that's open to anyone. So looking for things you can just go watch. You don't even have to participate, but just go see who shows up. And if anyone resonates with you, honestly, I'd say 99.9% of the time, people are really open to helping out and giving you half an hour for chatting about your business or theirs, right? Like people are really generous with their time. So don't be afraid to ask. The worst that they could say is no.
Right. And one comment you made earlier stuck with me, which is you said this is not just an idea, it's also a business. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences with women entrepreneurs and their business models? What have you seen in terms of how robust they are and how can they test for themselves the robustness of their business models and make sure that they're, in the shape that they need to be if you're going to be fundable or investable by an outside party?
We do a little bit of work on that, but because we just focus a lot on the fundraising kind of journey, I mean, a lot of times the women that we see have something already built and it'll change. I mean, it'll change as obviously as you grow, as you speak to customers, as you test it out, as you get feedback, all those things tend to change. I think what we've learned is simpler is better. there's a tendency to want to create something from scratch or reinvent the wheel. Like, you don't need to. Try and see how you can build something in the absolute simplest way possible without sinking too much money into creating prototypes. And like, just start off with something really, really simple that you can just practice talking to people about, seeing if it makes sense. And as you build something, you can start researching what are other companies, what are their other business models look like. Because again, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So sometimes stealing something that works somewhere there and like implementing in your own business is a great way to test something for yourself, right? But there's nothing static here. I think that's part of the myth around entrepreneurship is like, you'll build something, you'll get there, it'll be done, then you'll raise, and then you'll grow your business. It's always changing. It's always evolving. And actually, my advice would be is to be careful about advice, actually, because you're asking me for advice about it, but I would say be careful about advice. I think one of the things that investors specifically want to see from entrepreneurs, but what you want to see from yourself is you're going to get 1,000 different types of opinions about your business model or about anything to do with your business. You're going to get 1,000 different pieces of advice with 1,000 different people. So really what's going to be more helpful in terms of figuring out what works for you is trusting your gut and really listening to what people are saying. And if you gut is saying, no, that's not how I want to do something, listen to that. No one is going to fault you for saying no to somebody's advice if you've got a good reason why not. And especially investors, they want to see you have opinions and perspective on what you're building and not just blindly take advice. Just because some hotshot VC told you to do things one way does not mean that's the right advice. Nobody knows your business like you do. And it's okay to say, that's interesting. Either let me think about it, I'll get back to you, or that's interesting, I've thought about it. However, we're going to go this way because of this. And this is why we've decided to go in that direction. That's what people want to know. They want to know that you're thoughtful and not just taking, if you start taking on everybody's advice, you're just going to end up in the asylum. It's just too much. So I think trusting your gut and trusting what you think is the right thing is always good, and not paying too much attention to what everyone's trying to tell you.
One of the points you mentioned earlier was around this capital stack, right? The fact that there are so many other sources of capital that perhaps entrepreneurs aren't aware of. What have you observed in your experience at the TCN in terms of the biggest areas of ignorance or lack of knowledge? And what can women do to learn more about more diverse, non-dilutive sources of capital and how to assess the fit for their specific business?
This is something that maybe you can ask the Chamber of Commerce or economic development groups in your cities, because some of them actually have programming to help their businesses. And if they don't have the right programming that you want, you can definitely ask them to think about putting it on. And one of the things that we do with a lot of companies that we work with is put them through a lean canvas. And you can look this up. There's a lot of things online about it. It's essentially like a piece of paper that's divided into different segments. And you fill this in to get an overview of your business. And that's a really great way to start that journey around how do you understand what questions you need to ask, who you need to ask them of, and where you're going, is by doing a simple lean canvas exercise. And again, there's a lot of videos out there to like help you work through it, but it's always good to have someone help kind of like run through that as well.
Let's say I've done that. I've got a sense of how much capital I need. This high capital intensity, low capital intensity businesses. How do I then figure out, or what do you see work well with your entrepreneurs to match what you have as a business and some level of capital intensity to the right capital sources? What is that process?
So part of that is by going through the lean canvas, you get to realize what kind of company you have, and what kind of company you want to build really dictates where you're going to get money from. If you've built a business where you're like, I love this business, I want to run it forever, I want it to be mine, and I want it to be something that I can do, and I want it to grow a little bit, but I just want it to be manageable, then angel and VC is not going to be the right one for you. By virtue of, if you don't want to sell your business and if it's not going to be big enough to provide at least a 10x return to your investors, then that's just going to be a non-starter. A lot of that is around what kind of business you have and what kind of future you want for that business. If you're in a sector that needs a lot of capital, like a lot of the life science sector, or maybe some of the edtech sectors where things take longer and you need more money to like build things, then sometimes, investment is trickier But sometimes it's better to go to grants, non-dilutive grants, because the government is actually interested in funding some of those projects that will be able to kind of be put back into the NIH or the DoD or whatever it might be. So they actually have portions of money allocated to support innovation and support growth in those fields because the government might have a vested interest in actually accessing those. And the great thing about SBIR grants is that you don't owe anybody anything. It's a grant. You don't have to pay it back. Woohoo! And some of them are millions of dollars. So part of that is really just being aware of, yes, the options that are out there. And we have so much information on our website around the different types of funding, different sources, and what that looks like. So feel free to go to thecapitalnetwork.org. But it's really about like matching what's out there and the options as well as where you're at and what you want to build. And sometimes the only person that can do that work is you because you're the only one who knows what your business and what you want it to look like. But asking yourself very serious questions like, what's right for me? There's what's right for my business and how I want it to grow. And then there's also me as the founder, like how much do I want to put into this? Where do I see this going? How long do I want to run this for? Do I have support from family and friends to take this on? These are all questions that are really worth asking so you don't go down the road into something that ultimately won't be the right fit for you.
One other question on that, which is this whole ROI on the fundraising process. So you talked a little earlier about your ROI on attending networking events, which was well taken. But there's a similar calculus that needs to happen for the funds that you choose to pursue. So particularly in the case of grants, my observation is there's the government grants, which are big and worthwhile, but they tend to be restricted, as you mentioned, to the tech sector. But there are also some private sector grants. And my observation, and I'd like you to challenge this if this is not true, is that they tend to be small, very focused, and generally require a tremendous amount of work for what I perceive to be a very low shot at getting them. How would you suggest, or what have you seen work well for entrepreneurs in deciding which grants to pursue and whether they should even be pursuing them because they have a limited amount of time and they need to be building a business?
I think that's very apropos, right? It's analyzing the cost of anything. And the most precious thing you have as an entrepreneur is your time. Especially for something like an SBIR grant, which is bigger, you will need help to go through it. You'll probably need to speak to an expert. It needs to be reviewed. Like there's a specific language that they like to see. And whilst there's plenty of resources to help you maneuver that, and by the way, the SCA and other groups really want more women to get those. And there's more and more incentives out there to help more women take part into that. So there are a lot of resources out there, but it is very time consuming. So yeah, it may or may not be the right balance for you. One of the things I think that any entrepreneur needs to ask themselves is how can I get someone to do this for me? Part of it is there's a lot of, like I said, resources and people you can call up on, and creating a structure around you with advisors, mentors, other entrepreneurs, all of that stuff. Lots of people have applied to grants. And so really making sure you're talking to people who've either applied to things, have received them, and really understanding what that took, how much time, how reporting was there. I mean, reporting is one of those things that's such a drag, right? Like you've been given the money, you've used it, now you have to explain all over again how you used it and why. And why did you spend 30 cents here? And why did you spend 50 cents there or whatever? So the first thing you need to do is really talk to people who have received those grants in the past and really understand what their takeaway is. Understand how much support they got from the grantors. Some foundations give a lot of support to their founders. They want to see them succeed. So they don't just give money, they also give time and resources and networks. And similar to investors, you want the investors, they're good, and the foundations and those kind of sources of money that are not just going to give you money, but that are actually going to give you time. They're going to give you access to their networks. They're going to be champions for you because they really believe in what you do. So no matter where you get money, it's always the same questions you have to ask yourself. It's like, what am I getting besides money? How much time is this going to take? Who do I know that I can talk to really get the kind of the behind the scenes scoop, which is why it's so great to create a small network of entrepreneurs, because chances are they've spoken to that investor, they've applied for that grant, whatever it might be. So it's really creating that dialogue and not being afraid to ask, because again, people are very forthcoming about their experiences and you don't want to go into something blindly. The other thing that I would say too, when it comes to investors, to not waste your time and to feel like you're ready. One of the things we have on our website is it's a big database of all sorts of investment groups in the US, right? And one of the things we want to make sure entrepreneurs do is take that list or any list that you start creating, and it's an Airtable, so you can just download it. Look at all the sectors, how much money they give, what sectors they are, where they're placed, do they fund women, what check sizes they have, like who's on their board, who you might know in common, all of that stuff. Create this big Excel spreadsheet for yourself and then segment that into 3 buckets. Most likely to fund you, somewhat likely to fund you, least likely to fund you, and then flip that model. Start with the people least likely to fund you so you can really test out the questions you want to ask, what you need to be ready with, what kind of questions that you want to ask them and they're going to ask you. So you're not going after the people who are most likely to fund you first. And that way you're not wasting your time or you're not burning bridges when you're just not ready yet. So being able to create that funnel for how you're going to approach getting outside funding in a very strategic way is so, so important. So you're not just going at it blindly and having a list of questions on your end. I think entrepreneurs are used to investors asking them questions. It is just as important for you to ask them questions. Again, these are long-term relationships. You want to know what you're getting into. And there is absolutely nothing wrong. And in fact, it's really important to ask them, what are the founders have you invested in that I can talk to? Because what you want to know is not just the entrepreneurs where things went well with the investors, you want to talk to entrepreneurs where things went badly for them. And like, how did the investors react? Did they come through? Did they provide support? Did they provide, you really want to test that out. And that's on you. That's on you to really make sure you're getting into a situation that is comfortable, where you have confidence, and where you're really building something with someone.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. So you did talk about other entrepreneurs that the investors have invested in. What other questions should an entrepreneur be asking any potential investor during this whole pitching process?
I mean, that's a technical question. So there's like, who's the lead investor? Or do you syndicate with other groups? Do you partner with other groups to put funding in? Do you do follow-on funding? If it's a VC firm, when does the cycle end, right? When do they have to expend capital? And when do they just start a funding cycle? That's really important for you to know. Maybe you want to ask about the LP, like who funds this funding group, right? Like you want to try and have some of those questions. And then you want to also have questions about like, tell me a time when a startup wasn't doing so well and how did you manage that? How did you manage that with your founder when they were running out of money or when they had to do a down round or when they had to like find scenarios that you want to know about and then ask them like, how did either the individual investor or their group react to that and help support the entrepreneur? Like that's really important. And also things like, what is it that you are looking for? What is it that you want to see? What kind of returns are you expecting, right? What are some of the terms that you're used to seeing? A lot of the times when there's the first initial conversation where you're just feeling it with somebody, and then there's the following conversations where you're starting to get into kind of more negotiations. Negotiation can sound scary. All they are is conversations. You just want to know what people expect, and you want to know what to expect, right? So there's no surprises. It's great to also ask the investors, what are some of the questions entrepreneurs usually ask you that they want to know about, right? It's okay to ask that. Then you get ideas from other people. And it is also, again, something if you have the group that you can talk to, is getting that list of questions so that you're ready and you don't walk away feeling like things are still in a black box.
I loved earlier when you talked about this funnel approach where you said start with the ones that are least likely to fund you because there's basically no downs or very little downside for you because they weren't going to fund you anyway. One related question to that, and I've seen some research that says, and also heard some anecdotal stories about how women are running into more situations, especially if they're diverse, where there's this performative aspect of DEI where VCs or other investors will talk to them so that they can say, hey, we're talking to all these diverse entrepreneurs, but they're not seeing the same uptick in funding. In other words, getting checks and stuff like that. So how do you as a woman entrepreneur stay vigilant to see signs of this kind of performative action? And what can you do or what have you seen done by other women entrepreneurs to minimize this kind of risk and ensure that they're going after investors who are actually serious about investing in someone like you?
Yeah. So we have a mentor in residence and we were just talking about this very recently. It's very difficult to know who's just talking to you because they've got some kind of box to tick. And so my advice for that is look for, and this is where your research comes in of creating that whole document about, is looking at their portfolio. If they've never invested in a woman or a person of color, don't expect to be the first. Don't. You're wasting your time. A lot of that is that background research around look at their portfolio. Look at who the entrepreneurs they've invested in are. Look at what that kind of sectors are in. Like all of that will tell you if they've done it before, likelihood they'll do it again. And so that's part of it of how you get ready is people who are serious is like, okay, what have they done in the past? And does that match someone like me? Now, there is a first time for everything, but to not waste your time, I think that's really a good piece of advice. One of the things I would recommend, and we do this in the fellowship, we talk about the difference between what questions women are being asked versus what questions men are being asked, right? People who are in this kind of industry have talked long about this, but it's still happening. And the difference is between preventative and promotion questions is what we talk about, right? So there's a lot of research by professors from Harvard, and Donna
Dana
Kanzi is usually
Kanzi.
Donna
Yeah.
Kanzi is usually the name that comes up. And actually, she was one of the people we talked to in our investment and inclusion series. And the difference between those two things are men tend to be asked promotion question. And a promotion question is something like, how big can this be? What are some of the things that are going to make you successful? Where do you see this going? It's kind of like having a conversation around all the possibilities and the expansion of the business. Women tend to be asked preventative questions, which are more around like, what are you going to do if things don't work out? What if you lose all your customers? What if Google starts being your competitor? What are you going to do then? It's all the questions that back you into a corner to talk about all the things that could go wrong. And while some of these questions might seem totally normal for an investor to ask, they're really pointed at women specifically. So we actually do some work around how do you flip those conversations? How do you try and create an opportunity for you to answer the questions that's being asked, but also say, well, here's what we've put in place so that we make sure that we retain our customers because we know that this is how big this can be and we can really build this company to X, Y, and Z. So making sure that you're answering questions, but also putting it back onto creating a picture of the organization that you want to build. Now, it's tiring and frustrating because on one hand it's like, do you play the game or do you say, you know what, this is bullshit, like let's be done with this? And the answer is a little bit of both. I think one of the things you have a choice of is you have a choice sometimes to confront things and just say, this is what I'm noticing and I don't feel like this is appropriate. Or sometimes it's not, right? Either because it's not on you to keep educating people, quite frankly. And so that's one of the extra work that women entrepreneurs have to do is balance when you're going to challenge something and when you're not. When you start noticing those patterns or when you start noticing why are investors always asking you what your husband does for a living
Do they
or
do
how
that?
many kids you have. Yeah. Yeah. What does your husband do for a living and is he supportive? Classic question. You could possibly do this on your own. And so there must be a man somewhere to like help you out. And like, if there is, good for you. You've got someone helping you. But that's not the point, right? And sometimes, as you know, those questions only become apparent like 2 days later. When you're like, why was I so uncomfortable? And 2 days later, you're like, oh, it's because this was weird. It was weird, right? That they asked this. Sometimes you don't know in the moment, and that's okay. But there's that balance between that women and people of color have to face, which is what do I address? What do I not address? How much do I play the game? How much do I try and circumvent this whole thing? And that's a constant question you have to be asking yourself.
So is there a rule or any kind of heuristic that'll help you decide as a woman entrepreneur how much is enough? Something that you've seen work?
To be honest, I think a lot of this it's gut instinct is like if something feels off, it's probably off. And you can sit with it for a while and think about, like I've had interaction with people where I've just been like, something's not right. Something's off. Like the way they talk to me, the questions I'm being asked, something's just not quite right. And sometimes I'm like, okay, this is not somebody I really want to be involved in, and I will not be involved with them anymore, and I will avoid them, and I will just stay away. Sometimes it's so egregious and obvious that I have to be like, do you know what? I don't think this is appropriate, or I don't feel like this is a question that I need to answer, but that puts you in a vulnerable position. So you have to be really in touch with what you're willing to give and willing to do and willing to address. And again, it's totally fine if you feel at that moment, you know what, this is not the energy I need to expand right now. That's totally fine. Because if that's all you did all day, then you wouldn't have time to run a business.
One other big juicy topic that I'd love to hear your thoughts about, which is about negotiating the terms of your deal. That's a critical part of fundraising. What tips would you offer? And what have you seen women entrepreneurs and particularly diverse women entrepreneurs do well to make sure that they get a bigger check amount, they don't give up as much of the company, and they also get a better valuation?
So a couple of things. I mean, one is practice, because it is something that, again, you don't really know. So some of that is like practicing with other entrepreneurs that have gone through it, understanding what deals look like and feel like, understanding what kind of things people are particular about, right? A lot of times the entrepreneurs are like, oh, well, valuation's the most important thing. And it's not. It really isn't, especially if your valuation is too high and you don't raise enough money in the next round. Like that could really cost you in the end. So valuation is actually not the most important thing. The terms are what's important. Having really good legal advice is critical. You don't want this to be your cousin's best friend. Like you want this to be someone who really knows about the startup world. You really want to know what you want to get out of it. Like, are there things that are non-negotiables for you? Are there things you're open to? One of the things entrepreneurs in general make is there's really a lot of standard terms, and a lot of that are what people are used to. And it's okay to go with that. It's also okay to not go with that. But my point is that you don't want to try and make things too complicated. The more complicated the terms end up being, the more it's probably going to cost you in the end. And so really understanding what basic terms look like what people call vanilla terms, right? Like your basic kind of most agreements look like. There's like key principles, like really understanding those and why investors are keen on one and why entrepreneurs are keen on another and what benefits an entrepreneur, what benefits an investor. Ultimately, if you have good investors you're dealing with, their priority is to keep you with a big enough share, is to keep you excited and involved in the company. It's not to phase you out because they want you to be excited about building this company and making this bigger. That's not to say that at some point you may not be the right person to lead the company anymore. That happens a lot. You build it and then you find somebody else who's got that growth expertise. That's okay. But no, that's okay for you. If you're not okay with that, then maybe you might want to reconsider getting investors. Is this something you want to run the rest of your life? Or maybe this isn't the right thing. So that's why I'm going back to like being clear about what you want and how you see this company growing and making sure you're with investors that they have a vested interest in keeping you excited with the right number of shares and the right support system and all of those things. Because at the end of the day, as most investors will tell you, like, yeah, the idea is important, but the team is everything. You can have the best idea in the world. If the team isn't excited or able to execute, then again, it just doesn't matter. The idea doesn't matter, right? So part of that is all the things we've talked about lead you to that moment. Doing the homework within yourself, doing the homework with your investors, understanding the terms, understanding what could go wrong, understanding what people are really fussy about. Sometimes on the entrepreneur side, that's the valuation bit. And doing your homework and really understanding kind of what else is out there is really critical.
So I'm going to turn the conversation slightly to the investor side because you also work with a lot of investors at the Capital Network. What have you seen in terms of investors that are favorable to investing in women entrepreneurs? What's driving that? And what are some of maybe the headwinds that don't get talked about, the quiet parts that people don't want to say out loud that you think women entrepreneurs should be aware of?
I would say, first and foremost, to back it up slightly, one of the reasons why we created the Investment and Inclusion series is because a lot of the conversations I was having with investors behind closed doors was around the pipeline issue. I'm going to use quotation marks here, pipeline issue. A lot of investors were telling us, well, we want to invest in women. We want to invest in the new majority. We just don't know how to get to them. We just don't know where they are. We just don't know how to find them. We just don't know, blah, 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 blah. As someone who works with a bunch of women, I'm just like, you're not looking hard enough. They're everywhere. And I think that's part of it on the investment side is people are looking for an easy solution, but they're not doing the work to actually like do it. So when you're an investor and you're committed to investing in people of color and women, you have to change your networks. Chances are you're white and male if you're an investor. That's like statistically probable. And so chances are people around you are probably similar, right? And so part of the work that needs to be done is around changing your networks and around like accessing different groups and putting yourself out into situations that may feel uncomfortable because maybe you're not used to being surrounded by women or you're not used to being surrounded by founders of color or whatever that might be. So there is some work from the investment side. Part of it is also creating more spaces for women to invest and people of color to invest and like trainings to make sure that the next generation of VCs, emerging investment groups, all that are led by the people who are looking to put money back and build that generational wealth for women and founders of color. So there's work to be done like there. And then in terms of what is coming out, I mean, again, You're right in that there is a lot of conversation around, well, I want to do this. I want to invest in women. I just either don't know where to find them, which is what we just talked about, or it's performative. It's like, if I say this out loud, it'll make me sound good, but I'm just not going to go follow through because it's so much more comfortable to pattern match, to invest in people who look like you, sound like you, and speak the same language as you. So there is some work to be done to break that down. Some of that again goes back to like, if you're going to have these conversations, like understand whether or not they've invested in women before, they've invested in new majority founders before, so that you're not wasting your time and you're not having this dance around, will they, won't they, am I good enough? All of those little things that go into your mind when you're having these conversations with people. It's really tiring and draining. Fundraising is a full-time job, and you've already got a full-time job. And chances are, if you're a parent, you've got that third full-time job. So like, don't go into it lightly, and make sure that you have the conversation with the people who you can at least somewhat attest to being fully committed into this field. And also, by the way, not every company is going to get funded. That's just normal. And sometimes it's really about like, okay, if this isn't going to work out, like, how do I think about my company, and how are there other avenues for getting funding if this isn't the right avenue? The other thing I'll say too is, unfortunately, with the Theranos debacle, one woman entrepreneur falling ends up being a example for everyone else. So part of that is also just being prepared and having those conversations around your idea, your business, where you see this going, how the financials are going to work, and really being able to understand what investors are looking for and being able to talk to that. But my advice is, obviously, if you have a company that you in any way, shape, or form can grow without getting outside investment, do that.
Excellent. And to the point, are you seriously seeing Theranos being brought up as a potential deterrent by investors?
Yeah. So we had a founder who's in the life science, who's about the same age, and she's raised millions and millions. This is her second or third company. And she said she sat in a room full of investors and they brought that up to her. And she said she could feel it. She could feel they were weary of investing in someone like her. So it has been brought up. This is in like later stages, but it has been brought up. We were shocked. And she said, yeah, they had these conversations like right in front of me. And I was looking for funding, and I'm similar age, similar field, looking for a Series A. And it was quite open.
Wow, that's eye-opening. And are there, either behind closed doors or whatever, are there valid areas of concern relative to women entrepreneurs or their approach or anything like that that you feel would be constructive for women to take into consideration and work on?
No, I think women build different businesses, and they build better businesses because they're more used to overseeing a bunch of different aspects of, especially mothers, their own lives and other people's lives, right? So they're used to having that overview of what needs to happen and when it needs to happen by. I mean, we can talk about stereotypes all day. I don't think they're really helpful. But what we know statistically to be true is more diverse companies perform better. It's that simple. Having a woman on your team makes your company stronger. It's that simple. Having different groups, different sectors, different ages, the more diverse your company is, the more you can really future-proof your business. Because ultimately, and this is something that we were talking about in one of the sessions for the investment inclusion series, is at the end of the day, the US is a minority-majority country. If you're going to future-proof your business, if you're going to want to speak to the right customers, you need to start speaking to those customers right now. And those customers are the new majority. They're Black and brown women. Like, that's who your customer is already and is going to continue to be. So there's no reason why you should build a company that's full of white men. It just doesn't make sense anymore. So that's a big thing that people need to keep in mind too.
Excellent. Any questions that I should have asked you, but I didn't?
Oh, I can't think of any. You've been great. So many bits
and you've been fantastic.
So. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for letting us talk about the work that we do and the way that we want to see women be supportive as themselves, not as a proxy for what white male entrepreneurs are doing.
Excellent. We wish you all the best. I'm sure you'll do great things for yourself and for women. So thank you so much, Marie. It's been a joy having you and just all the informative stuff you told us.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
That was a very informative conversation with lots to take away. Here are the top 10 that I noted. 1, as a founder, you must understand and master the strategic importance of your cap table in the long-term success of your startup. 2, You'll do better at fundraising if you not only present yourself as a leader, but also see yourself as one. 3. Being a leader means owning the fundraising and being able to have the tough but necessary conversations. 4. Too many women founders forget to make a specific ask when pitching. Don't be that founder. 5. Increase your confidence by reframing your ask as an opportunity for upside that you're offering to your investors. 6. Don't forget to talk about how your business will make money. Without this, there's no investment opportunity to pitch, no matter how great your solution is or how big the problem that you're solving. 7. To get better, practice having the money conversations a lot. 8. Get checks only from investors you can work with. This is a long-term relationship. 9. Invest your time as carefully as you invest your money. Attend events or pitch to investors only when the odds are expected to be good. 10. Always be the final judge of what advice you'll take and what you'll let go, even when it's from investors. No one knows your business better than you. So, what one thing are you going to do differently tomorrow? Thanks for listening to today's episode. We have show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe and share with a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go be an achiever.